there's a related reaction which we call transesterification. And in transesterification, if we just look at our reactant and compare it to the structure of our product, we can see that what has changed is the identity of the carbon group on the alkoxy portion of the ester. So for example, if R prime were methyl and R double prime were ethyl, what we've done is replaced carboxyl O methyl to make it carboxyl O ethyl. So the reason why this would be called transesterification then is that we're basically transferring the ester from one alkoxy group to another one. Now this can occur under both acid and base conditions. So acid conditions would use the ester, the alcohol, and a catalytic acid like PTSA. Base conditions would use the ester and the alkoxide, the deprotonated equivalent of the alcohol. And base conditions would require one equivalent or more. If we look at the mechanism, the base mechanism follows classic SNAC. Our alkoxide reacts with the carbonyl carbon, moves a pair of electrons out of the way, tetrahedral intermediate, there's our tetrahedral intermediate again. Electron pressure pushes out one of these two groups. These are going to have very, very similar associated pKa's. So therefore, sometimes OR prime would be pushed out, sometimes OR double prime would be pushed out. And in fact, probably what we're going to need to do is put in something to encourage the equilibrium to shift to the right. So for example, we might run this in the protonated alcohol as the solvent. The acid-catalyzed mechanism is going to follow a classic PRAM mechanism. We're first going to add R double prime OH, and then we're going to remove our alkoxy group. So to add, we're going to protonate. So we protonate, we add OR double prime, we then make that stable. To remove the OR prime, we protonate the OR prime, we remove it, we make the resonance stabilized intermediate, and then we deprotonate to make stable. Now, a natural question in this case is, when we are at this stage right here, why did we protonate here on the OR prime? Couldn't we have just protonated on OR double prime? And the answer is yes. And that reaction is in fact written because protonating on OR double prime would essentially make this as the product. That's the reverse of this reaction. Another question is, what about if we protonate on the hydroxyl group instead? And that certainly does happen. And in fact, probably it's protonated, probably the OH2 plus comes off, but then the intermediate has no way to become stable. So eventually, a molecule of water would add back in, it would become deprotonated and whatever. So this is an example of what I talked about earlier in these PRAM type mechanisms, that there can be side branching reactions that dead end and don't make stable products. We're going to look at a couple other reactions of esters. One of them is hydride reduction. So we talked about hydride reduction with regard to ketones and aldehydes in a previous chapter. We saw that we can use things like lithium aluminum hydride to add hydrogen minus to a carbonyl carbon. So here's lithium aluminum hydride. In aldehydes and ketones, we could also use sodium borohydride, but it turns out sodium borohydride is not reactive enough to react with esters. So we must use lithium aluminum hydride. So the observed reaction would look like this. Start with the ester, treat it with lithium aluminum hydride, followed by hydronium aqueous hydrolysis. our product would be an alcohol, where we actually added 2 hydrogens to the carbonyl carbon, and we protonated on carbonyl oxygen. We would also get, as a byproduct, OR prime, which would be the alcohol of the alkoxide that we started with in our ester. The mechanism of hydride reduction of esters starts very similarly to the mechanism of hydride reduction of ketones. Again, we're going to use a formal mechanism where we're going to write this species, hydrogen minus, even though it probably does not actually exist as a standalone hydrogen minus in the reaction. So therefore, we're going to put it in quotation marks. But effectively, the aluminum hydride ion behaves as if it were transferring hydrogen minus. And the hydrogen minus is attracted to the carbonyl carbon because with a negative charge on the hydrogen minus, the carbonyl carbon has a partial positive charge, opposite charges attract. So we would get a bond formed from the hydrogen minus to the carbonyl carbon, and as we've seen many times before, in order to make room for that, we would have to push a pair of electrons out of the carbonyl C double bond O onto the oxygen. This creates, once again, our old nemesis, the tetrahedral intermediate. In this case, however, the tetrahedral intermediate is not stable, and in fact, the electron pressure from the oxygen negative pushes back down and pushes out OR prime minus as a leaving group. It cannot push out the hydride, so therefore we don't have a reverse arrow here. We aren't going to go backwards. Once that hydride adds, it's there. Now, the interesting thing is, when you push the alkoxide out, you recreate the carbonyl, but now, instead of being an ester, the OR prime is detached. Now we have a hydrogen directly attached. That makes this product, this intermediate, an aldehyde. And we saw in a previous chapter that aldehydes readily react with hydrogen minus, and in fact, they are among the most reactive of the carbonyl compounds. So we can't stop here at the aldehyde. Hydride adds again. We get this tetrahedral intermediate. Now, the thing with this tetrahedral intermediate is that it is stable because there is no leaving group that can be pushed out. Recall that hydrogens and carbon groups cannot generally be pushed out from tetrahedral intermediates. So we can just let this reaction run until all of the ester has been consumed, and what we would have in our reaction mixture at that point would be a whole lot of this alkoxide and a whole lot of that alkoxide with appropriate counterions. In order to make these into alcohols, then, we would, in a separate step, put in aqueous hydronium, and the alkoxide would react with the acid-base reaction with the hydronium, and that would give us our protonated alcohol products. We don't mix hydronium with lithium aluminum hydride because lithium aluminum hydride reacts explosively with water and aqueous acid. We can do a similar reaction with Grignard reagents. So, in this reaction, we put in the Grignard reagent in step 1, and then we put in hydronium. And in fact, once again, I neglected to write that we're going to put in at least 2 equivalents of the Grignard reagent. This reaction is sort of analogous to the hydride addition. Instead of adding hydrogen minus, we're going to add this R double prime minus. We've used double prime here because we have a carbon group here denoted by R. We have a separate carbon group which can be different from the first one, so we have to call that R prime. And then, in fact, the carbon group that we add as part of our Grignard could be even different from those two, so we're going to use double prime. What we see in our product then is that 2 equivalents of R double prime have added to the carbonyl carbon, and again we have an OH attached. Similarly to the other one, we also see that our OR prime our alkoxide has been removed and protonated. This mechanism is very similar to the hydride reduction mechanism that we just discussed above. We have R double prime negative, again, written formally this way, probably doesn't exist exactly like this, but effectively it behaves like it's a nucleophile. The pair of electrons react with the carbonyl carbon. Right here, we move a pair of electrons out of the way. We get this tetrahedral intermediate. Again, similar to the hydride reaction, that tetrahedral intermediate is not stable. We push a pair of electrons down, push out the alkoxide. That creates, in this case, a ketone. Here's a carbonyl carbon, one carbon group, a second carbon group. Ketones react with Grignard reagents. They react more rapidly than esters. So effectively, once we've made this ketone, it's going to react almost immediately with another equivalent of our Grignard reactant. Right here, Grignard's going to add to the carbonyl carbon, move a pair of electrons out of the way. And again, we're going to make another tetrahedral intermediate, which is going to be stable because it has only carbon groups attached in addition to the oxygen negative, and therefore there is no leaving group to push out. We can then, at a later time, once all of the ester has reacted, we can put in hydronium to protonate these two alkoxides, and there are our products. It turns out that esters can also be part of rings. We would call these cyclic esters, ring esters. These are formed when a carboxylic acid and a hydroxyl group are present in the same molecule. So this would be an example of a generic example of a molecule that could form a cyclic ester. We have a carboxylic acid on one end. At some point, we have a carbon chain attached. At some point on that chain, we have a hydroxyl group. So that makes this portion right here into OH attached to carbon. In other words, R prime OH. Under the presence of acid and heat, that OH could make a bond to the carbonyl carbon, force out the OH from the carboxylic acid, and we would get a structure like this where we have carboxylic acid on one side, carboxylate on one side, and O carbon group on the other. So that's effectively an ester, but that carbon group of the ester is attached by a chain back to the carbonyl on the other side. So we have made a ring. So we would call this a cyclic ester. Now, cyclic esters have another name. They're called lactones. There are different sizes of lactones which can be made depending on the length of the carbon chain that's connecting the C double bond O carbon to the oxygen. When chemists began to classify these, what they did was they called the carbon adjacent to the C double bond O the alpha carbon, and then they started counting along the chain. So here's the adjacent carbon alpha, the next carbon would be beta, and so forth. The lactone is then classified by looking at which carbon in the chain has the oxygen that is attached back to the carbonyl. So for example, in this four-membered ring lactone, we have alpha, beta, and then we go to oxygen and back to C double bond O. So we would call this a beta lactone. Five-membered one, we would go alpha, beta, gamma, oxygen, carbonyl, so that would be a gamma lactone. And six-membered one would be alpha, beta, gamma, delta, alkoxycarbon, carbonyl, that'd be a gamma lactone. These letters actually are the Greek letters that correspond to our Roman letters, alpha being A, beta being B, gamma corresponding to C, delta corresponding to D. So essentially they just named them A, B, C, D, but they used Greek letters to do that. Lactones are actually found very commonly in nature. But because 5 and 6-membered rings have a very small amount of rings tone, most of the natural lactones are either 5 or 6-membered rings or very large rings, which are often called macrolactones. An example of a naturally occurring lactone is vitamin C. This is the structure of vitamin C. You can see that we have a carboxylite on this end. We go oxygen, we go to a carbon here, and that carbon would be alpha, beta, gamma related to the carbonyl. So this is a gamma lactone. Lactones are essentially normal esters. They do hydrolysis reactions, hydride reductions, Grignard additions. The only thing that makes them somewhat unique is that in those reactions that we discussed, we would be breaking the bond between the C double bond O carbonyl carbon and the alkoxy oxygen. We would be breaking this bond. But if we do this in a lactone, breaking that bond is going to open the ring and convert it to a non-ring structure. So for example, hydrolysis of this gamma lactone would result in OH on the carboxylate side and OH on the alcohol side, but those would still be attached overall to the same molecule. Similarly, we could do a Grignard addition. We would start with this delta lactone. We would put in methyl Grignard. We would put in two equivalents. The Grignard would add, make a tetrahedral intermediate. Tetrahedral intermediate would push down, push out the O-, which would open the ring. We would then add a second methyl. So we would end up with two methyls on what was the carbonyl carbon, and then we would add the OH from this alkoxy group right here, protonated after we did hydronia. So, in essence, what you can see is that lactones are given a special name and they look different, but they are effectively just esters that are part of a ring.